You are listening to a podcast created by the Minnesota Alliance for Geographic Education. Our mission is to help you understand your world better through geography. This podcast is part one of two podcasts about European commercial agriculture. In part one, European regional agricultural patterns will be illustrated, and in part two, political aspects will be discussed. This podcast addresses two Minnesota geography standards for grades 9 through 12. Our presenter is Dr. David Lanegren, Professor of Geography at Macalester College in St. Paul and Director of the Minnesota Alliance for Geographic Education. I am Fred Kunze, a member of the Minnesota Alliance for Geographic Education. And now, here's Dr. Lanegren.
Agriculture in Europe has a long history, but we're going to focus this podcast on contemporary patterns in Europe, particularly Western Europe, as the comparison for commercial agriculture in North America. European commercial agriculture is a reflection of the environmental conditions of the continent and also the cultural tastes of people living in Europe and complicated international agreements within the European Union that affect the patterns of agriculture, how agriculture is subsidized in different countries, and how it is marketed. As you know, Europe can be thought of as a horizontal continent with mountain ranges that start in Spain and run along an eastern dimension and direction, rather, to the Black Sea, going from through the Alps to the mountains of the Balkans and so on. So south of that set of mountain ranges is a type of agriculture called Mediterranean, which takes its name obviously from the sea and the type of climate associated with the Mediterranean Sea and its shores. And then north of the mountain ranges we have commercial agriculture of mixed form that is actually the source for agriculture in the United States. But these climate conditions that are formed by the proximity of the land to water, particularly the oceans, but also, of course, fresh water on land that provides water for irrigation. But the most important thing is the moderation of the climates of Europe by the oceanic winds that provide a mild, moist climate for northern Europe, and for the Mediterranean, a climate that fluctuates but always is warm. So we have a wet season and a dry season in the Mediterranean region, and in northern Europe we have a climate pattern that fluctuates with a cold and warm season, but also a rainy season as well. And as you travel from west to east in northern Europe, it becomes drier. So the agricultural patterns that we see there today are a reflection of the environmental potential of the landscape and the various rules and regulations that have been put in place by the national governments. Historically, agriculture in Europe was organized around a pattern of estates, large landholdings held by nobility and people who worked for them, and then independent agricultural villages. Many of these large estates remain. It's possible to see them. They're restored and sometimes have been converted to other functions, or I should say additional functions to agriculture, functioning as bed and breakfasts or small hotels. But these large estates practiced a commercial agriculture and continue to do so. In the European pattern, in these large estates, all the buildings were interconnected. So you had barns and stables and houses and water mills and all tied together in one structure. And then surrounding fields were irregularly shaped because they emerged before the advent of surveying. with contemporary techniques. And then they grew a pattern of crops that in basically were small grains and root crops, and of course livestock. So we see here a pattern, the German pattern, and then an estate in Denmark, which continues to function as an intensely cultivated agricultural system, but also has a bed and breakfast functioning as well. The maps here show the different sorts of agricultural villages that were associated with the German settlement as the Germans moved eastward. This is frequently called the Drag nach Osten, the movement to the east, where German settlers were brought in to basically diffuse agricultural types among the Slavic populations to the east. So we had a pattern develop where the villages were set up, and then the large estates occupied the land in between. The large estates generally using more extensive grain agriculture, and the villages doing more intensive mixed agriculture. And there are several kinds of these villages. Geographers are interested in talking about the shape of the village. One type is where all the houses are lined up along a road, and the farmers' fields go back in long strips away from the homestead along the road. These are called Straßendorfs, or towns along the roads. But there are other patterns where villages might be round or other sorts of shapes. But basically, this distinctive feature here is the farmers lived in clusters and farmed the surrounding fields independently, where in the United States the farmers are spread over the landscape. The towns that emerged in the development of European agriculture were like the estates, a mixture of residential and agricultural structures. Here we see some scenes of town in northern Germany in the hops growing region. Hops, of course, used for brewing beer, and so the farmers lived down on the lower stories, and the upper stories were ventilated, and the hops were dried in that region. If we look closely at this map of agriculture in Northern Europe, focusing on Germany, but looking also at Poland and France, if you cast your eyes first to the east and find Warsaw, you can see the symbol there that looks like little beets. This, of course, is the symbol for sugar beets, a very important crop in Northern Europe. You also can see the little pig symbolizing pork production, and the green and yellow for small grains and pasture. Coming westward, you can see Berlin with the symbols of forestry, and then again sugar beets, and further west hogs and cattle showing up. And then again, as you get closer to Paris, you see grapes and sunflowers and other sorts of things produced. But the symbols here are meant to be pictographs. And again, you can see the basic pattern is similar across Northern Europe, but there are some interesting variations. Now, if we look closely at Germany, since the 1950, the number of farms has decreased from roughly 1.6 million farms in 1950 to 630 farms in 1990. So in general, a decline of 1 million farms. However, despite the decline in the number of farms, agricultural production has increased in Germany. And in the last decades, a single farmer could produce enough food for 75 people.
You have been listening to Part 1 of Commercial Agriculture in Europe. Be sure to listen to Part 2, which focuses more on the political aspects of European agriculture. This podcast is a production of the Minnesota Alliance for Geographic Education. Background music is courtesy of Jim Hogue of Decorah, Iowa. The Minnesota Alliance is a nonprofit group of volunteer educators and others who work to promote an enhanced understanding of our world through improved geographic literacy.